Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown and the resignation of Lord North as British Prime Minister signaled the end of the colony's 7-year struggle with Great Britain.
The fall of the North government meant that peace negotiations would begin. Richard Oswald was sent to Paris to negotiate with Benjamin Franklin, with John Jay. Henry Lawrence was supposed to be part of the negotiations, but he'd been captured by the British and was in the Tower in London. Jefferson had been appointed, but he didn't get over there. So really, Franklin and Jay did the bulk of the negotiation with Richard Oswald. This was a very fascinating experience because, of course, they had been told to do all of the negotiation in consultation with Vergennes and the French government. But shrewd people that they were, they simply disregarded these instructions from Congress.
And the French foreign minister did find out that this was going on and had to, because the French had really prompted Congress to say, don't make peace without our active involvement in the process. Basically, the French wanted this war to stop, and the Spanish didn't want to give up until they'd retaken Gibraltar, which had been British since very early in the 18th century. And so this gets the French off the hook if the Americans are going to make a separate peace with Great Britain. And since Britain actually did want to detach the United States from the French and the Spanish, it meant that they were willing to make a lot of concessions to the Americans, like the Mississippi River as a western boundary.
In 1782, November, the preliminary articles were signed, and then the final peace treaty in September of 1783. Independence was won, a large chunk of territory was won, and Franklin even had the guts to go back to Vergennes, having gone behind his back, and say, but by the way, it's going to cost a little more money than I thought, and would you give us another loan? And Vergennes said yes. So it was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver.
The military conflict may be over, but the political struggle within America still simmers.
Even after the Revolution had succeeded, the long-term prospects for the American colonies as a union for the United States were very much up in the air. All through the 1780s and 90s, you can see lots of anxiety by Americans themselves about the longevity of this experiment, about the precariousness of this union because of internal difficulties and also because of threats from abroad.
Arguments over remembering the Revolution began to surface. Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Washington and all the others had different recollections. Not that they disagreed on everything by far, but they had different takes on the Revolution, and sometimes got quite angry with each other about what was remembered or what ought to be remembered.
We look back now and we know how the story came out, and everything seems to us, if not preordained, very stable, very predictable. The leaders of the country and many elements in the country were quite sensibly worried. It was one thing to break away from England, quite another matter to keep these separate colonies working together.
With the fighting over and the peace treaty signed, the true costs of war become apparent.
So there was tremendous disruption, economic depression, and some period of recovery from the costs of the war. Those who had been loyalists or who were suspected of being loyalist, or who were insufficiently patriotic in their sentiments, also faced certain kinds of disabilities. Some went into exile, some faced the prospect of having their properties confiscated.
The war has a significant effect on other minorities as well, especially African Americans, who have witnessed firsthand the struggle for freedom.
First of all, the war itself is destructive of slavery. It allows many slaves to run away to both armies, where they find shelter and eventually freedom. The ideology of the American Revolution, the notion that all men are created equal, is very corrosive to the institution of slavery.
I think by the time the Revolutionary War is over, blacks in every part of the 13 now independent countries have come to believe that the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence is really talking about them too, that they are also entitled to the rights of man, to freedom and equality and fulfillment. And during the course of that conflict, many of them had volunteered to fight in the armies of the revolutionists, the Continental armies. And there is an expectation, as the British are finally beaten toward withdrawal, that slavery is coming to an end, that white people mean to wipe that system away as incompatible with this new definition of freedom they have.
It was said that a slave in Charleston, South Carolina, went through the street shouting liberty. Well, that was enough to send shivers through the patriots. And so, as always, the abstraction, that sense of the biggest, most philosophical understanding of freedom, went together with a whole series of subterranean qualifications.
So there is a tremendous sense of shock and, I think, disappointment among blacks when it's clear that for many whites, the elimination of slavery was not what they were talking about, that the rights and equalities they were pursuing were for them. So you have a black community that begins to feel very critical of the disappointments that come about from the revolution. And there's a small group of educated blacks that begin a fierce critique of what they will outline as the hypocrisy of white Americans in terms of being unwilling to be slaves to other people, but quite comfortable enslaving other groups of people.
And it's that the opposition of slaves that combined with the ideology, combined with the war, which will eventually set the North on this path to gradual emancipation. Now, those same forces are at work at the South, in the South as well, and although they're not strong enough to overthrow slavery in the southern states, they are strong enough to allow many black people to gain their freedom.
Many Native Americans also viewed the American Revolution with skepticism. Most tribes chose to stay out of the war. A few had not.
It seemed to many Indian people, especially the Mohawk, that the British were so powerful and the Americans so weak that the Americans were going to lose. So it made good sense for many Iroquois people to side with the British, which turned Americans even more so against Indian people. This has happened earlier in the 1750s and 60s with the French and Indian War, and then it occurred again during the American Revolution. There was a lingering hatred for Indians who had sided with the British. Even though there were Native peoples who sided with the Americans, they seemed to forget this. And it played into American politics in the post-war period.
Indians were not represented at the Peace of Paris, but of course Indians had no idea that they'd lost the revolution because they hadn't. But they didn't figure in the negotiations, and Americans after the war believed that because of the Peace of Paris, they had a claim to all of Indian country by the right of conquest because they had won the war and conquered their enemies.
At the same time Americans were struggling to win their independence on the battlefield, they were also struggling to create new institutions of government for themselves. They found it much easier to shape their state institutions than to decide on a form for their national government.
Not every new state did it the same way. Some states would have constitutional conventions, some would have their assemblies contribute to writing new state constitutions, because that was the first process, and that actually began even before the war was over. These new states, having thrown off the royal authority, had to constitute new authority within each colony, new state.
For example, John Adams wrote the state constitution for Massachusetts in 1779. It had to be submitted to be ratified by every town in Massachusetts, which was a couple of hundred. And then when the ratification came back with great revisions and changes, he rewrote it in 1780, and that had to be resubmitted. And the extraordinary thing about this is that we have the responses of the towns of Massachusetts. There are over 200 of them. We have what they wrote back. And you have the picture, at least in Massachusetts, but it's true in many other places as well, of groups of people, farmers, people in taverns, preachers, whatever, getting together and writing back their considerations on the clauses of the Constitution. So you get, it is really quite remarkable, you get a bunch of farmers in Amesbury, Massachusetts, which maybe had 300 people in it, who write back very severe comments on the clause relating to the Supreme Court. I mean, I don't think they knew anything about the Supreme Court, but they felt the obligation to comment on this public document that was being imposed on them.
In the cauldron of the revolutionary movement, they began to imagine what we now think of as the rights of men, which would ultimately become the rights of women too. Natural rights, rights that, as they put it, had been given to human beings at the creation and therefore could not be taken away and were inalienable. And no one had talked in this language in a serious way to start a political movement before. And you might have thought that they would just leave it at that. An argument that's good at a particular moment does not have to stick around. But by embedding this in the Declaration of Independence, that generation made it a piece of the cornerstone of the language of American democracy in a way that had not been done before.
That whole process of constitution writing and thinking about it and envisioning the world as they wanted it to be was a very exciting one, but also one fraught with many unknowns and difficulties and disagreements of the kind that you would expect. So that was exciting and a highly fertile and interesting period in political thinking and in political participation.
The Confederation, under the Articles adopted in 1781, is confronted with even more daunting challenges.
There were unsettled issues. The British did not evacuate the Northwest forts as they were supposed to. The fisheries question was not completely resolved, and the British did not give compensation for slaves that they had taken with them and freed in the South. So there were a number of lingering issues.
During the 1780s, there were so many problems in the United States. Economic problems, social conflict within the country, problems with their British and their Spanish neighbors, problems with the Indians, that it became manifest that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, and they weren't the right balance point.
In 1784, Congress sends John Adams to London to resolve these differences, but Adams makes no headway with the English. The young nation experiences similar difficulties with Spain.
There are all kinds of shady characters, fomenting of secessionist movements, especially in the Southwest, what was then the Southwest, what we would now call Louisiana and Mississippi. Spain controlled the Mississippi, closed the port of New Orleans. This was in a country that is trying to get back on its feet economically and restore trade. This was a major blow. The United States, especially under the Articles of Confederation, was far from overawing international powers with their might, and they weren't getting any respect from these foreign countries.
The question becomes then, what powers does Congress have? They aren't given the power to regulate trade. They certainly don't have the power to tax. And it's therefore a very weak government. And why is it that weak a government? And I think it's really because sovereignty resides with the states, not with the United States.
That's the paradox of the Articles of Confederation. They were good enough for the war, but they were impossible during time of peace. And simply the reason for that is the United States didn't, in 1783, become truly independent of the world. there were lots of outstanding problems that had to be negotiated, namely commercial treaties with the European powers, a stable peace. American prosperity depended on European trade. One of the things that Americans desperately wanted was a favorable commercial treaty with the British, which was not forthcoming. And nobody took the Americans seriously after the Peace of Paris because they had no leverage in the international balance of power.
The Confederation's most significant accomplishment during the 1780s is the resolution of at least some of the controversies related to Western lands.
There were lots of people, regular folks in the 80s, who were looking around thinking, I'm not getting what I thought I was going to get out of this revolution. I thought that there would be easier access to land. Well, on the frontier, it turns out that a lot of the land was bought up by large proprietors or by land speculation companies, and it turned out it wasn't so easy to get their hands on this land.
They've acquired this land through one means or another, often in enormous quantities, and they're looking to resell it, and they're looking to resell it at as high a price as possible. And one of the things they then do, of course, is send out lots of propaganda extolling the incredible virtues of the land, so that you get descriptions of places, whether it be Kentucky or a century later Nevada. Of course, the problem is not just the quality of land that is available, but sometimes the best land has been pulled away by people who have connections and make it impossible for people to get secure titles.
The Ordinance of 1784 divides the Western Territory into self-governing districts. Each district can petition Congress for statehood when its population equals the free inhabitants of the smallest state. The following year, Congress creates a grid system for surveying and selling Western lands.
I think some Indians, upon seeing the migration, many of them were themselves refugees from places further east and had moved west in order to create a buffer between themselves and land-hungry settlers. To some extent, for them, this was a repetition, and some, seeing the advance of Americans, especially by the mid-1770s, decided to move further west and moved into what was then Spanish territory west of the Mississippi River. Others stayed and thought that they could reach some accommodation with the Americans. Others, especially seeing how difficult it was to accommodate Americans, thought that the best policy was to come together and fight. And of course that turned the Ohio Valley frontier into the dark and bloody ground that it becomes known as during the 1770s and 1780s.
And this, of course, led to a generational conflict in Kentucky and the Ohio country. And it was only in the 1790s that the balance of power in Ohio tipped toward the Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794.
If the Confederation experiences modest success in dealing with Western expansion, it clearly fails to deal with the nation's mounting debts.
There's tremendous economic disruption after the war. Obviously, England had been the major trading partner of the American colonies. A lot of people are holding currency, which is valueless, and also questions about how to re-establish the economic system and how to get things going.
The hero, really, under the Articles of Confederation is Robert Morris, the Secretary of Finances. And he, all along, struggled against what he thought was best, that is a strong centralized government, and the realities that the states were not going to meet the requisitions.
To preserve the financial integrity of the new nation, Morris lobbies for a 5% duty on imported goods.
And it was an attempt to create a somewhat more powerful federal government, in which there would continue to be this balance between state sovereignty and national sovereignty, but that significant powers would move out of the states and would move into this federal government.
And the problem with that strategy was that it could never overcome the basic hurdle of the requirement under the Articles of Confederation that all amendments had to be approved by a unanimous vote of the 13 state legislatures. So unanimity proved a real tough hurdle.
Without a national solution, the debt problem remains with the states. All they can do is raise taxes. The farmers in western Massachusetts revolt.
Shays' Rebellion was prompted by a combination of desperate economic circumstances and a sense of of the little people being crowded out by larger economic and political interests. And so many people, for lack of a better term, we might call them more kind of conservative or concerned for law and order types, looked at Shays' Rebellion and said, this republic business is already complicated. This is exactly the kind of thing that we were worried about. This is the too much participation, too much democracy, which was a negative word in the 1780s and 90s. Democracy was next door to mob action. And that's what many people saw as the message of Shays' Rebellion. Washington, when he was informed of Shays' Rebellion, said, perhaps we have had too favorable a view of human nature in forming our government. So this gave justification and impetus to moving toward a government that would have more protections for the property classes, for law and order and stability, as opposed to worrying quite so much about protecting against the encroachments of power in a central government.
Well, there's a lot of discontent in America, producing things like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. So ordinary people, when they do talk about where we're going to go, they really seem upbeat. This is going to be just a great country. Look at all the resources we've got that nobody else has. If we can't preserve this union, this is not going to be the heaven on earth that you think it is. If we split up into rival confederations, well, then each one will want to get the advantage of Western resources for itself, and they may start arming against one another. If we stay united, we might keep European power out of most of North America in any very active way. If we divide, we become just part of their balance of power, and the cost to us will be really enormous.
And the major argument for constitutional reform then became, we need to unite so that the other powers of the world will take us seriously. If we don't, those very same powers are going to take advantage of our divisions, and this will be the opening wedge for counter-revolution.
For these people, the stakes were very, very high. This wasn't just about, will the House of Representatives go back to the Democrats this November, a question that might seem very important to us now. It was about whether there would be a free House as opposed to a monarch or a dictator coming in. Would there be secret conspiracies to overthrow the legitimate power? Because they lived in a world in which these were not untoward, ungrounded fears.
It became increasingly clear that the Articles of Confederation had to go. They had to be replaced by something else. However, there was so much nervousness about even bringing this up for debate that people agreed that they would not institute a new government, but they would only modify the Articles of Confederation.
For most of the 1780s, the basic agenda of reform for men like Madison, John Dickinson, Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, had been to try to put together some kind of strategy that would enable the Articles of Confederation to be ratified in a kind of piecemeal way. And I think the basic idea was to try to get one amendment adopted and then another, and then to demonstrate that you could actually strengthen the national government without creating a tyranny on the other hand.
Having seen what they thought was a tyrannical government, they were most concerned to erect all kinds of hedges against tyranny. They didn't want a strong central government.
And so finally that leads in 1786 to the expedient of calling it the Annapolis Convention. Really as an independent body, not quite tainted the way the Continental Congress was being tainted in terms of public perceptions in the 1780s. And the problem with Annapolis was that although 8 states had appointed commissioners to go there, only about a dozen guys from 5 states show up. So they don't really have enough of a quorum to do anything. But they didn't want to adjourn empty-handed, so they proposed a general convention to meet the following May.
It was a good thing that Annapolis didn't succeed, because then that allowed these energetic visionary nationalists to take the next step. Because the argument was always that if the Union fails, then anarchy is the next result. And so every successive failure in efforts to amend the Articles also led to this escalating concern about the future of the Union and of the Revolution.
In the months immediately leading up to Philadelphia in May 1787, is the recognition that the time has come not only to save Congress from the states, not only to enable the national government to act independently of the states, not to be dependent upon their compliance with all its recommendations and requisitions and resolutions and proposals and the like, but also to save the states from themselves.
As delegates to the Constitutional Convention begin their journey to Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, some may recognize that the Articles of Confederation did play a significant role in the early days of the Republic.
Under the Articles of Confederation, we survived as a nation. We were not invaded by our former enemies. We learned what it was to create a government. We learned that the states were going to have to work with each other, that they didn't have the war to unite them anymore, so that they had to find other ways to do it. And they got a lot of practice in governing. So I think the Articles of Confederation served a very useful purpose and were an excellent transition to the Constitution. Got people thinking about what it is to form a government. So when they met, first in Annapolis and then in Philadelphia, they could get down to the serious work of framing a constitution.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.